It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Creek Stewart. Hi, Creek. Welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be on here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, my pleasure. I was really intrigued by your bio that your people sent me, and because it's something that I don't think I've had on this show before. And
okay.
When or somebody who does what you do. And when I saw that, I thought of those guys. I don't know, there's a lot of YouTube videos of these people that make these huge bunkers and underground, and they spend millions of dollars for these things to go right underneath their house with ventilation systems and all kinds of stuff. But that's not exactly what you're doing, right?
No, it is not. So A, I don't have a bunker, and B, more importantly, I don't have millions of dollars.
Okay.
And so in lieu of both of those, I prefer to focus on really practical preparedness techniques that the average person could implement with very little time, with very little knowledge, and with very little money. So I've found out a long time ago that the harder something is and the more expensive something is, the least likely someone is to do it. And so those are the things I focus on.
Well, your book is called Disaster Survival 101, The Essential Guide to Preparing for and Surviving Any Emergency Scenario. So are we talking about hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, or are we talking about nuclear war, or all of the above?
Well, the way I like to frame a popular question that I get is, Creek, what should I be preparing for? And the answer to that question is simply, well, history is a really good teacher. And so at the top of the list are natural disaster weather events that are likely to happen or that have happened in your particular region or environment. So for a lot of people, those might be hurricanes or tornadoes or wildfires, as we've seen out in California recently, or flooding if you live along a coast or a waterway. And so I'm really practical when it comes to what are you preparing for. Most often they are large scale natural weather events. But the good news about being prepared for a large scale disaster is that you are in turn prepared for a lot of other potential disasters as well. Our survival needs are all the same regardless of the disaster. And so if you're preparing for, let's say, a tornado and something else happens, chances are you're going to have your ducks in a row for that as well.
Well, if you remember The Wizard of Oz, there was a huge tornado that comes through, and they had a tornado shelter, which was essentially a hole in the ground with some doors on the top of it, right? Or what should people do who live in tornado areas like Kansas and Missouri and places like that, and they don't have millions of dollars to build an underground bunker? What can you start with?
Well, that's a great question. So in the particular instance of a tornado, you normally receive very little warning. And so it's not typical that you would evacuate from a tornado. It's very much more common that you would hunker down and wait out the event. And so the safest places, without building a separate tornado shelter, which would be some type of a concrete structure. A lot of times you see those in people's backyards or a mound of dirt with a door. But for most people, the best place to weather out a tornado is going to be a basement. If a basement isn't available, a crawl space. If a crawl space isn't available, it's going to be the innermost room in the house, farthest away from most of the windows and doors.
Under the stairway?
Under the stairwell is a great place.
Yeah.
So the most injuries during a tornado are from flying debris. whether that's inside of your house or outside of your house. And so wherever you could take shelter inside of your house that would be the farthest and most protected from windows and doors, that's going to be your safest spot.
Now, I remember doing some kind of earthquake drill where people said, stand in a doorway.
Yeah, so the thought logic behind that is that doorways are typically much more sturdy than if you were standing next to a typical wall. So if you think about a door, oftentimes it's multiple studs framing up each side of the doorway. So the danger in earthquakes are things falling on you, are things falling in the house, shaking loose from the house, potentially windows breaking, shattering glass inside the house. And so the idea behind standing in a doorway is it's a framed-in structural part of the house, and it's not typically somewhere where something's going to be falling on top of you.
Okay, so your book, Disaster Survival 101, give us kind of an overview, because we've been talking about specific types of disasters, but you said at the beginning that this book really would apply to almost anything, right?
That's right. So I walk people through. So I wrote the book for people who have never really gotten into preparedness before. Maybe this is their first time thinking about long-term food storage, or how to store water in an emergency, or what do I need as far as communications go if our cell phones don't work. So this is written specifically for people who have really not done anything quite yet and are looking to just get started. So I walk through two main categories. Sheltering in place, what would you need to have in place at your home if you were to shelter in place through a disaster? And then the other category is evacuation in the event of a hurricane, for example. Oftentimes people would evacuate, or a wildfire. So what would you need to have in place in order to safely evacuate and in search of a safer destination? And so I cover all of the main survival categories. We cover fire, water, we cover, food, water, regulating core body temperature, backup power, backup heat, all of those things that we would depend on a regular basis if the grid goes down and all of a sudden those things aren't available.
Well, I always get a kick out of seeing when a hurricane is approaching in Florida and people are going to Costco and stocking up on toilet paper. And,
right.
and it's just not the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Right.
Obviously we need it, but bottled water, okay, I get that. Batteries, yeah, sure. So what are some specific things, if you're going to shelter in place for a particular type of disaster, what are some essentials that you would recommend people have on hand?
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I answer that, you bring up a great point with people kind of mobbing the stores for toilet paper. So that's the great thing about having plans in place in advance, because those knee-jerk reactions of running to a grocery store in the midst of a crisis, clearly it's very easy to make horrible decisions, right? Filling your truck with toilet paper when it's probably the last thing on your list of priorities when it comes to survival. and so ideally, one great thing about being prepared in advance is you've already made those decisions in times of peace and in times of calm, so that you don't have to make so that you've already made those decisions in advance, so that when the crisis happens and you might be a little scared or you might have a little bit of panic, you've already made those decisions, and now it's just a matter of executing a plan that's already in place. So with that said, one category that a lot of people overlook in terms of preparedness that is really important for human survival is water. And water is, I like to think of water as three different headings, three different categories. Water is bulky and it's heavy. So can be very difficult for people to store in large quantities. So I like to suggest that people have fresh water storage in place for 2 weeks, and that's 1 gallon per person per day, because we not only need to drink water for hydration, but then we have hygiene and cleaning, and water is a modern convenience that oftentimes is interrupted or polluted in the time of a natural disaster. So with 2 weeks of wet freshwater storage, that buys us a couple of weeks, but if the event would happen longer, we want to have a gravity water filter on hand, okay? A gravity-fed water filter is a filter where you pour questionable water in the top. Maybe it's rainwater, maybe it's water from, a puddle outside or a pond or a creek. You pour that in the top, it gravity filters through a filter, and it comes out the other side safe to drink. The one I typically recommend is one called Pro One, Prone. It's available on Amazon for about $150. I'm not affiliated or associated with that company. It's just the one that I use and the one that I trust. But a gravity-fed filter can keep you in fresh drinking water as long as you have access to water. And so the third category to water is you've run through your freshwater storage, you have a filter, but maybe you don't have a renewable source of water like a lake or a creek or a pond. And so the solution for that, to establish a renewable source of water for most people, is going to be a rain barrel that is connected to the downspouts, to the gutter downspouts of your home. And for most people in most parts of the country, if you have 2 weeks of freshwater storage, a gravity-fed filter, and a rain barrel, you are 90% there to independent water survival in the event of a large-scale disaster.
I want to back up just a bit. We've got about 4 minutes. How did you get started in this? Because it looks like you're sort of doing this. This is your career, right? You're doing speeches and presentations. Did you go through a disaster yourself at some point and then decided to try to help other people?
It's interesting. So I do live on a river, and I have been through a flood disaster in my life, but it's not really kind of what got me into this line of work. So 25 years ago, I started as a wilderness survival instructor and taught wilderness survival skills for many years. And then one thing led to another, and I became the in-house survival expert at the Weather Channel for over a decade. And during my time at the Weather Channel, I got to see a lot of large-scale natural disasters firsthand, and actually filmed a show called SOS How to Survive, where we interviewed people who had been through natural disasters. We went to the locations and taught what maybe they could have done differently, and interviewed them about their experiences. And so I have a really, really unique insight into the world of disaster with those firsthand experiences working with and for the Weather Channel. My first book on the subject was Build the Perfect Bug Out Bag in 2012. And I've written Disaster Survival 101, which is what we're talking about now. But my book before that was called Disaster Ready Home, which is also a disaster survival book. So over the years, teaching and helping people with disaster has definitely become a huge part of my career.
So I took a look at your website. You give, you do live performances, live presentations. Are these, I don't know the right word to use, concerts in the sense that people just buy tickets to come see you, or are these sponsored by particular corporations like TED Talk or something like that?
Yeah, so a little bit of both, but definitely less on the concert side. So typically a speaking engagement that I would attend is for a company or a church or an organization where I speak on a particular theme or a topic that maybe is the theme of their event or their meeting or their company. And I draw unique parallels to wilderness survival and disaster survival. It comes to find out, I've learned that, wilderness survival and disaster survival have a lot of interesting parallels with life, whether it's fire or being prepared or being lost in the wilderness. There are a lot of unique analogies that can be drawn between that subject and things like business or things like faith or not-for-profits and things like that. So just a unique perspective on what the company or organization might be interested in.
Yeah, I suspect the 21st century man with his iPhone glued to the side of his face is really ill-prepared for any kind of a disaster to happen. In some people's mind, the disaster is when they can't get a signal on their phone. That's a disaster. Right. So, I mean, like a real disaster, I don't think many people would even have a clue what to do.
And I think you're right. And that too is a reason why I, have written, this is my third book on the subject, is I'm doing my best to make this stuff a little bit less doomsday prepper, like how we open this conversation about a big $1 million bunker. I try to make it a little bit less about that and more about, this is common sense stuff that everyone should be thinking about. Large-scale disasters are more frequent and more dangerous than ever before in our recorded history. And it's just a new part of our reality. I always say the next disaster is next week. And the phrase I always use is, it's not if, but when. And I believe that to be true when it comes to experiencing a large-scale disaster.
Okay, the last thing I want to bring up, and then we got to wrap it up. Terrorism. How do you prepare for something like that? I mean, I'm thinking of 9/11. Those people had no idea. Is there anything you can do to prepare for something that nobody thought would ever happen, that is even possible?
Well, my answer is going to harken back to what I said earlier, is that, I think it makes most sense to prepare for the things that are most likely to happen or that maybe have already happened in your area, to prepare for those things, and then you are indirectly at least more prepared for something obscure like a terrorist attack. And so it is impossible to have perfect plans because you can't predict every disaster is different. Even every tornado is different and impacts areas in different ways. So unfortunately, your plans are never going to be perfect. But I can tell you through experience that those who have put plans in place typically fare better than those who do not. And the good news is that any level of preparedness moves the needle in a big way for you and your family if something were to happen.
Well, that's a good point. All right. Well, Creek, we got to wrap this up. Again, the book is called Disaster Survival 101. I see that it was released in December. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, just a few months ago.
Okay. Last question. Do you want to give out your website?
Absolutely. So if you would like to learn more about me or what I do, it's creekstewart.com, just my name, creekstewart.com. And if you go there and sign up on my email list, I'll give you 3 of my best-selling survival guides for free.
All right. Well, again, nice meeting you, nice chatting with you, and best of luck with your work.
Thank you so much, Douglas. I appreciate the opportunity.